What's up, Dynasty fans? This is Levi with Data Driven Dynasty. A little bit of background about myself is that I have experience in medical research and I really enjoy playing fantasy football. And so I wanted to try my hand at doing some fantasy football analytics. So here we are with the pilot episode of Data Driven Dynasty, where we will be taking a deep dive into Cincinnati Bengals running back Chase Brown and trying to get to the bottom of the narrative surrounding Chase Brown and the 2024 Bengals season. So the current narrative is that Moss was the starter. Chase Brown gradually ate into his workload. Brown took advantage of the increased workload. He showed he was the better back. He gained trust from the coaching staff. Moss continued to fall off to show that he was not that guy, that he was not very good, before he was injured in practice before week 9 and placed on IR, out for the season. Then, after that, Chase Brown was a dominant NFL running back for the rest of the season in both fantasy and for the Bengals, in that moving to 2025, Chase will continue to be the unquestioned starter if the Bengals don't draft a high end running back in the rookie draft. But is this the truth? We are going to break down 3 questions to try and answer that. So, first off, did Chase Brown truly win the Bengals backfield? Is he a top NFL talent? And is it likely that Chase Brown will get the backfield to himself next year? Jumping right into the numbers, here I have graphed out weeks 1 through 9, showing snap share, red zone opportunity, and total opportunities per game for both Moss and Brown. Here in the orange highlighted section, we have the first 5 weeks of the season where Moss was the starter. He's receiving more snap share, more red zone opportunities, and more total opportunities. Then in this red section, we have where Chase Brown took over the backfield. He was getting more snap share than Moss over this period, more red zone opportunities, and most importantly, almost twice as many total opportunities per game. And then here in the black section is when uh, Chase Brown became the workhorse whenever Zach Moss went down with his neck injury. However, we are really leaving out one crucial detail here. Zach Moss had an ankle injury in week 5 against the Ravens. So let's dive a little bit more into Moss's ankle injury. It was labeled as a grade 2 high ankle sprain. While not so serious an injury that it would land you on the IR, like a broken bone in the ankle or a torn ligament, a grade 2 high ankle sprain is still a significant ankle injury. And the ankle is super, super important for running backs. Being able to plant your foot and push off with any strength is what gives you power. It's what gives you agility and really gives you a lot of your mobility. And so this kind of injury usually limits an athlete from 3 to 6 weeks. Taking a closer look at Moss's efficiency before and after this injury, we see that before he was getting a not great but respectable 3.7 yards per carry. After the injury, it was down to less than half that at 1.8 yards per carry. And so, unless we're assuming that Moss became a significantly worse running back, seemingly overnight, then we have to attribute this fall in efficiency to his ankle injury, which aligns with, historically what we've seen from this kind of injury is that running backs and other players are much less efficient. Now going back to this data table, once we have a little bit more context about Moss's ankle injury, we can see that in this Week 5 game, where Brown for the first time had more total opportunities than Moss, Moss actually left the game early. And so, in order to really hone in on what the earned total opportunity share was here between these two players, we have to look before Moss came out of the game because of his injury. And so, doing that, we see that Brown actually only had 11 opportunities up until the point when Moss left the game. And so, from this data, Moss was still that 1A to Chase Brown's 1B. And then moving forward into the red section, weeks 6 through 8, it makes total sense why Moss was being limited. He had just suffered a high ankle sprain, and because of it, his efficiency was absolutely suffering. And so it's also here hard to say that Chase Brown really earned the starting running back role whenever he was competing with an injured running back partner. I mean, at this point, weeks 6 through 8, Zach Moss was almost literally a shell of himself, running for half or less yards per carry than he was before. And so, in order to conclusively say that Brown had earned more opportunities, had become the starter, we would have had to see Brown competing against a healthy Zach Moss. And because of his neck injury in week 9, we never really got to see Moss performing in a window where he was recovered from his ankle injury. Now, you might be thinking, fantasy points don't lie. Chase Brown was absolutely killing it with the fantasy points, even when he was in the committee. Even when Zach Moss was healthy in week 4, Brown still put up a huge game. In week 5, Brown put up a good game. But if we, again, break this down a little bit, we can see in this chart, weeks 1 through 9 again, on the left, we have Brown and Moss's fantasy points in those games. On the right, we have their fantasy points produced in those games minus 6 points for each touchdown, so minus the touchdown production. When we look at the left side of the graph, Moss was outproducing Brown in weeks 1 through 3, and then Brown took over in weeks 4 through 8, the rest of the time that Zach Moss was on the field. Brown was outproducing him. However, if we go over to the right side of the graph again, through the first 3 weeks, Moss was outproducing Brown by a pretty wide margin per game. But weeks 4 through 8, we see a totally different picture. Moss and Brown were producing pretty equivocally to each other. Some weeks Moss was producing more, some weeks Brown was producing more. With the exception of week 6, the week right after Moss came back and started to play again after that high ankle sprain. And so I'm willing to write week 6 off a little bit. But especially looking at weeks 4 and 5, Brown was not significantly outproducing Moss whenever they were both healthy. And then whenever Moss was still suffering from inefficiencies in weeks 7 and 8, Moss was still producing very similarly to Brown. And so what we can see here is that who was scoring the touchdowns over this period was incredibly, incredibly important to who was going to score more fantasy points. And this paints the picture, especially with the context that they were getting comparable numbers of red zone opportunities, that the variation in fantasy points scored here between Brown and Moss was more likely due to a random variation in touchdown scored, as opposed to a sustainable increase in fantasy production starting in week 4, whenever Brown was scoring more fantasy points. So in any one of these games, essentially, if Moss had been the one to score a touchdown, he would have significantly outproduced Brown. Now we'll move into the next question. Is Chase Brown a top NFL talent? Starting with some efficiency metrics, over the course of the season, he was tied 26th at 4.3 yards per carry, which comps to some players like Tony Pollard, Rachaad White, Brian Robinson Jr., Kenneth Gainwell, and Audric Estime. Breaking that number down a little bit further, though, before Chase Brown was asked to undergo the workhorse role, he was getting 4.6 yards per carry, which is significantly better. After the workhorse role, however, he was rushing for only 4.2 yards per carry. And then just for reference, pre-injury Zach Moss was rushing for 3.7 yards per carry. Diving into some more stats here, the one I'd like to talk about next is the 2.6 yards before contact. This statistic is very, very important because it helps to equilibrate, to normalize for the effects of the offensive line and for the system and for the scheme of the offense. And so a team with a very low yards before contact or a player with very low yards before contact, their team would not be providing them very much room to run, and their efficiency you would expect to be lower than other running backs because they were having to do more work per rush to produce fantasy points. And so at 2.6 yards before contact, the only fantasy relevant names that had better yards before contact last year than Chase Brown were Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Derrick Henry, Jordan Mason, James Cook, and Austin Eckler. And what all these running backs have in common is a combination of a good offense, a good line, a rushing quarterback to boost the efficiency of the running back. And so, with those three factors, it makes total sense why these 6 names had a better yards before contact than Brown. But that still means that Brown had a really, really good yards before contact, even with a mediocre offensive line. When we talk a little bit more about the Bengals as a team, although they don't have a great offensive line, they realistically were a good situation for a running back to be in. They had the most dynamic passing game in the league last year, so likely instead of the running game being used to increase the efficiency of the passing game, it was the other way around. And so the passing game, the dynamic passing game that the Bengals had was actually increasing the efficiency of their running game because defenses were so worried about the pass that the running backs had a little bit more room to run. I will add that there was one other player, fantasy relevant player, who had a better yards before contact than Chase Brown that didn't really make sense to me was Tyron Tracy Jr. And so whether he's an outlier or the Giants offensive line was actually putting in some work, that still puts Chase Brown at 8th in the league for starting running backs for yards before contact out of 32 teams. Now, when we look at his yards after contact per attempt, it's not very good. 1.6 yards after contact is fairly mediocre. It compares with names like David Montgomery, Ramondre Stevenson, Rachaad White, Tyron Tracy Jr., Alexander Mattison, and DeAndre Swift. And so, while he doesn't have a good yards after contact, you might say, well, his explosiveness, his speed was actually increasing his yards before contact. And so that would have been a big factor in calculating yards before contact, is he was, through his own skill and athleticism, was increasing the yards before contact. However, if we look down at some of these next stats, 18th in juke rate and 29th in explosiveness rating per Fantasy Pros, Chase Brown wasn't really going above and beyond in either of these categories either. And so it's unlikely that his high yards before contact was significantly increased by his own athleticism and skill. Moving on to the last stat, he was pretty inefficient in the receiving game as well, only ranked 23rd in yards per reception at 6.67. Moss actually was about a yard and a half higher than Brown at 8.13. And this stat actually includes while Moss was playing through his high ankle sprain. Next, I'd like to take a look at his expected fantasy points per game. This is also per Fantasy Pros. Expected fantasy points per game is a stat that estimates, based on a player's opportunities in a game, how many fantasy points they should score. And so it's based on the running back and how good they are. And but it also doesn't take into account their scheme and their situation. And so a good running back in a bad situation would have less points per opportunity. However, we've already talked about how Chase Brown actually had a really high yards before contact. So even if the offensive line is mediocre, or was mediocre in 2024, Chase Brown was still getting ample protection, ample room to run. And so with that in mind, we see that his expected points per game was 22.35. Looking at his actual fantasy points per game from weeks 9 through 17, it was only 20.63. And so he was almost fantasy points, scoring 2 fantasy points lower than what was expected of him. And again, this expected fantasy points per game is assuming an average running back in an average system with the opportunities that Chase Brown had received, that they would have been scoring 22.35. So this further reinforces the notion that as a workhorse, Chase Brown is average or maybe even less than average as a starting running back. So again, looking at a different metric, average running back points per game through weeks 1 through 8 versus average running back points per game weeks 9 through 17. And so this is comparing the combined total of Zach Moss's points and Brown's points in the first 8 weeks, and then combining Chase Brown and Khalil Herbert's points in weeks 19 through 17. And so one would expect that if Chase Brown was really the better running back, if he was just that much more efficient, if he produced better without Moss, that the average running back points per game produced for the Cincinnati Bengals would be higher in weeks 9 through 17. However, when we actually look at the numbers, the average running back points per game in weeks 1 through 8 was 21.5 on 25.75 opportunities per game. And through weeks 9 through 17, the average running back points per game for the Bengals were only 21.4 on 25.5 opportunities per game. And so when you account for the difference in opportunities, they were essentially scoring the same amount of fantasy points per game. And what we can draw from this is that the combination of Brown and Moss together in the backfield was producing at an incredibly similar rate to when Zach Moss was out and injured, and Brown was the workhorse. And again, the 9 through 17 includes Khalil Herbert's minimal contributions, but he was rushing for less than two rushes a game, and so his contributions were fairly minimal. Moving on to the next slide. So why was Chase Brown scoring so many fantasy points if he wasn't elite? So if we try and answer that question, we can see that he had really high volume. There are some games where he was getting upwards of 30 opportunities. In week 9 against Las Vegas, he had 32. Week 10 against Baltimore, 24. 11, 29 opportunities. Week 14, he had 20. Week 13, he only had 15 opportunities. And so he was getting really high volume. He was getting 24.5 opportunities per game over the span of weeks 9 through 17 when he was the workhorse back. And so he was getting true workhorse volume during this time. And he was getting all of the receiving work. There are games with 11 targets, 7 targets, 6 targets, 5 targets. So he was getting a ton of the receiving work. And to top it all off, he was getting an unusually high rate of touchdowns. He scored 6 touchdowns in those 8 games, which is a very, very high rate. If you project that over the whole season, that would be 12 or 13 touchdowns, and that would have been one of the highest touchdown rates of any running back in the league, behind guys like Saquon, Gibbs, Derrick Henry, and James Cook. So will Chase Brown get the backfield to himself again? Well, Bengals offensive coordinator has noted multiple times that he wants to add another running back, someone who can complement Chase Brown's strengths and cover for his weaknesses. And so where would this running back come from? The most visible right now, the most understood threat at this time is in the rookie draft. People are excited about the rookie draft, and so that's where they are looking for Chase Brown to receive competition in the backfield. It wouldn't be an absolute surprise with their perceived need at running back if they drafted a rookie in the NFL draft. However, I don't believe that they are likely to draft a rookie running back in the first 4 rounds because they have significant needs elsewhere on the team. They're a pass-first offense, and the big thing is that they have Chase Brown and 2 other guys under contract in the backfield already. The first of which is Zach Moss. Although he's dealing with this injury, Zach Moss still has 1 year left on his contract. The cap hit would be $4.8 million with the dead cap value of $1.5. And while you might say they can just cut Moss and save the money, if we are assuming that Moss would come in next year and kind of be that 1A, 1B, or even a backup to Chase Brown, well, $3 million a year is a backup running back salary. And so why would they cut Zach Moss, who's already under contract, who has shown that he can be a reliable starter for them if needed, and go and pick up some other backup running back that doesn't know the system, that they don't know if the running back will be a good fit? And so the consensus right now is that Zach Moss is going to be cut and that he might not even play football ever again. But when we look at his actual injury, the early reports were projecting him to be healthy in time for the AFC Championship game if the Cincinnati Bengals made a postseason run. And so, we don't have a lot of details on his neck injury and when Zach Moss might be healthy, but the fact that he avoided surgery and he was projected to be back in time for the Super Bowl, it's perfectly reasonable to expect that he would be 100% and ready to go heading into the 2025 season. While his injury history is relevant, I don't think that it's something significant enough that would keep the Bengals from moving on from him. That would keep the Bengals from wanting to cut him. So Samaje Perine is the other back who has just been signed to a 2-year, $3.8 million deal. He is a former Bengal. He is a player that the coaching staff knows. He's a player that the coaching staff can trust. But at $1.9 million a year, that isn't really even backup running back money. That's third string running back money. And so what makes the most sense is that the Bengals were okay rolling into the year last year with Moss and Brown as their lead backs. But then Moss, went down with the injury. Chase Brown was forced to step into that workhorse role. And so it makes sense that they brought in Samaje Perine as kind of an insurance policy. That if one of these 2 backs went down, they would have another third back that could step up, that they could trust, that could take snaps. And so when we're talking about whether or not there's going to be someone else in the backfield next year, there's a really, really good chance that Zach Moss will be back and that he will be a significant part of the offense. Even if he's not, there's still the addition of a rookie or trading or signing for a different running back, or Samaje Perine himself, who's a solid running back who can do everything for you, but maybe not any particular thing incredibly well. There is going to be someone else in the backfield with Chase Brown next year, one way or another. So in conclusion, Chase Brown at best earned a committee backfield with Zach Moss while he was healthy. Who knows where the season would have taken us over the last 8 to 9 weeks of the season, but up until that point, we only have evidence for Chase Brown earning a committee backfield as the 1B. Secondly, Chase Brown is a solid running back. He can handle a workhorse role. However, he became less efficient when he was put into that role. And if the Bengals want to get the most out of Chase Brown as a running back, they are incentivized to pair him with another back who can take snaps and who can take opportunities away from Brown so that he will remain at a high efficiency. Thirdly, Zach Moss is expected to be a part of the Bengals offense next year. While Chase Brown did have a higher efficiency rate while rushing, Moss is really exactly what the Bengals were looking for last year. He was a good pass blocker and he was efficient in the passing game. And so for a pass first offense, Zach Moss made a lot of sense. That's why they signed him in the first place. And so he's still that player. He's projected to be healthy for next year. He's going to cost them $3.3 million in cap space, but that realistically is around the range of what a backup running back would cost. And I don't really think that the Bengals would be comfortable going into the season with just Chase Brown and Samaje Perine. And I could be wrong, but especially considering what happened this year, it makes a lot of sense that they would want to secure a little bit more running back depth. So, what's next? What do we do from here? So, to work out a reasonable projection for Chase Brown, we need to assume that the Bengals are going to produce around 21 running back fantasy points per game next year. They just signed T. Higgins. Jamar Chase is still there. Joe Burrow's still there. They're still expected to be a pass-first offense. And so there's not really a reason or an expectation that this 21 running back fantasy points per game would drastically change. And so if Brown is getting 40 to 60% of the opportunities because he's splitting the backfield with one other back or maybe two other backs, then what we get is around 8 to 12 fantasy points per game. And realistically, it could be even worse. His floor could be even lower because not all opportunities are made equal. If Zach Moss is in the offense again, well, we've seen that he was a much better receiving back. So if he's getting the majority of the receiving work over Brown, and Brown is getting the majority of the rushing work, Moss would be getting those more valuable, higher point touches in the receiving game. Likewise, if they were to add a running back in the rookie draft, it would likely be a power back, a short yardage back, someone who really could complement Chase Brown's weaknesses. And in that case, Chase Brown's red zone opportunities would be likely to plummet. And so even if he retains a lot of that receiving work, if he's not scoring touchdowns, then that would also significantly impact his fantasy points per game. And then long term, I mean, if we're looking at committee backfields, who would I rather have? Chase Brown, who I do feel confident giving us another maybe 2 to 3 years of 8 to 12 fantasy points per game. You could get that in a lot of other places for a lot cheaper. I mean, David Montgomery, who goes 2 to 3 rounds later in startup drafts, would be a good option. He was also somebody who is injury dependent to really take off, but I believe that Montgomery would have a higher ceiling than Brown did because of the dynamic run game in Detroit. And so if Jahmyr Gibbs missed a significant amount of time, Montgomery would be a much better option, would be a much higher fantasy producer than Brown would if, there was another back in the backfield with the Bengals next year who then became injured for a significant period of time. Some other players that really look pretty similar to Brown at this point are guys like Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears. I mean, if we are looking at guys who are going to produce 8 to 12 fantasy points per game, that sounds like Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears. Spears and Pollard aren't significantly older than Brown either, and so in the long term, it would be hard to project any of those three guys as more than a low-end running back two over the next couple of years unless there is a significant situation change. And so in the near future, next year, Chase Brown's projection isn't great. And long term, his projection is honestly even worse because if the Bengals are incentivized to use him in a committee, if a more talented back were to enter the backfield, then he could lose even more work. Whereas even if there's not a more talented back, the Bengals or any other team that sign him would be incentivized to use him in a committee to limit his workload to retain his high efficiency. And so what should we do now? What's the plan for Chase Brown? What should we do with him if you're an owner or if you're interested in trading for him? So we'll play some buy, sell, hold. First off, I think Chase Brown overall is a sell. He is unlikely to pay off his RB 10 to 12 price tag. At this price, you are expecting him to produce probably at least two RB1 seasons in the next couple of years, or three or four RB2 seasons over the next 3 or 4 years. And I believe that he is unlikely to pay off this price tag. Based on this projection, based on the fact that he's in a pass first offense, based on the fact that he is better on a limited workload, and that he is likely to lose a lot of the high value touches in the offense. But moving on to hold, I also think that that would be a decent option because if we're expecting Moss to be back, then I don't believe the Bengals would take a running back very highly in the 2025 rookie draft. And so, since the narrative, the expectation is that Brown will be the unquestioned workhorse if they don't draft an enticing rookie, then you could hold him through the rookie draft and sell him for a profit after the rookie draft. And I think that that is also pretty reasonable, especially since there's a lot of questions right now. People aren't really trading for Chase Brown very much because, his future as the lead back is pretty uncertain, especially with the rookie draft around the corner. And then finally, if you want to get pretty crazy and really play the market, I would also be okay if you tried to buy Chase Brown right now. If you can buy into that uncertainty, get him on the lower end of his value right now, and then hold him through the rookie draft and trade him and try and make a profit there, get a small market value win there. I also think that that's pretty reasonable. However, I would really only do that if you can get a good price on Chase Brown. You aren't overpaying for him, and then you believe that someone in your league would really be willing to pay up for him in the event that the Bengals didn't draft a rookie very highly. So, apart from Chase Brown, well, what about Zach Moss? And I think that this is a great time to buy Moss. Everyone has basically left him for dead. You can get him for 2 4th-round picks or a 3rd-round pick, a late 3rd-round pick in the 2025 draft, or just a 2026 3rd-round pick. And he could be a guy, especially if he retains part of the red zone role next year and is getting the majority of the passing work in the dynamic Bengals offense. He could be a guy who's also putting up 8 to 12 fantasy points. And he's going in the 20th round of startups. You can get him for basically nothing in existing leagues. And so why not take a shot on a guy who could be a solid RB3 for your team next year? What's his long-term outlook? Not great, but I mean, for that price tag, if you can get a guy on your team who's going to put up some solid high-end RB3 fantasy points for you, why not take a shot? All right, and that is the conclusion of the video. If you liked it, then leave. If you enjoyed the video, then leave a like. If you have any disagreements with any of the content, my analysis, my data, go ahead, put that down in the comments. I would love to have some more discourse, get some feedback from you all, and see, after watching this video, how do we feel about Chase Brown going into the 2025 season? Are you keeping him, holding on to him? Are you a firm believer, or are you going to try and sell him, move off of him for a different running back in that range, or rookie picks, or maybe a wide receiver? So go ahead, let me know, and thanks for watching.